Sometimes we need to quote somebody, whether it's a book passage or something somebody said on a different blog. There's a lot of different uses. Think of it just when writing a normal article with pen and paper. There are sometimes when you need to quote somebody, and we can do that within HTML as well by using what's known as the block quote element. Now within here, this is a way to tell the browser anything within here is a quote. So why don't we reference an Einstein quote? I've pulled up a list of some of his quotes. Let's just get one of these. So within here, it is a paragraph, so I'm going to make sure that I add a p tag, paste it in, and close out my paragraph as well. And remember what we learned about indentation? It's a good practice to make sure we indent so it's easy to tell that this paragraph is a child of the block quote. Good. So let's save that and view it in the browser. So if I view it, it may not look like anything special to you, and that's okay because remember, if you were expecting maybe big, shiny quotation marks or at least the text to be italic, that's not what markup is about. Markup does not specify formatting or font weight or font style. It's simply to describe your content, and that's something you always need to remember. So you might be thinking, well, why would I ever use that? It's easy to do this. I get the same effect, and it's less markup. And it's because we are describing our content, and that is equally important, whether it be for screen readers or for future-proofing our markup. So let's save that, and if I view the source, once again, you can go to View, Developer, Source, or I always press Control-Command-U on the Mac. And now we have given the browser some understanding as to what this specific content is. So just remember, if you're writing a blog posting, if you're doing a website, anytime you need to provide a call out, and it's again a nice way when creating blog postings to divide your content. Once again, if we refer to NetTuts, you can see that we use block quotes like so. Let's check it out. Inspect element, and once again, you can see that it is wrapped within a block quote. And within here, we have our quote. And then we're using styling or cascading style sheets to make the text italic, to add a quotation mark here to make it look like a quote. But the markup alone is simply a block quote with the paragraph tag in it. Today, we're going to learn about anchor tags, and this allows us to connect one page to another. And this can be a local page, or we can even link to a different website. So let's take a look. I'm going to add a paragraph tag, and I would like to say, visit me at my site. I would like to make my website a link to my personal website. So we do that by wrapping it within an anchor tag. We do that, it has an element name of A, and we can do it like this. So let's wrap it. But then this alone will not work. Let's see though what happens when we view it in the browser. And as you can see here, even though my website is wrapped within an anchor element, it's not even receiving any styling. So we need to add a specific attribute that specifies what we are linking to. That is vital, and it's required for all anchor tags for obvious reasons. So we do that by specifying href. Some people will say href. You'll also hear people say href. Either will do. Now we need to say, what are we referring to? What are we referencing? So we will link to my personal website in this case. Now I will save it again, and let's view it one more time. And now you'll see that the browser has provided some default styling for anchor tags. We can see here that it makes the text blue or purplish for visited websites, and it also makes the text underlined to help specify that it is a link. But remember, you can override every single one of these things. So now let's click on it and see where we go. Now it's taken me to my personal website. Good. But notice we've lost our current page, and that's fine, and it is considered a best practice. Don't always open up new windows. That said, though, you should know how to do it because sometimes it does make sense to do so. So if we want to specify that this link should open within a new tab, I can add another attribute name. And you'll notice that some editors will provide some hints. In this case, we're going to specify target. What is the target of this link? And I'm going to say open it in a blank. Notice I've done underscore blank tab. So let's save it, and I'm going to reload the page. And this time when I click it, notice that it creates a new tab that links to my website. You'll probably want to keep it like this unless you have a specific reason where you need the person to stay on your website. But don't be greedy and do that by default because it tends to irritate people. Now, what if we want to link to a local page? So right now I have one page that I'm storing on my desktop, and you can see it's right here. So I will add a new file. And this one's going to be called, how about, and this will be our about page. Now I'm going to copy everything here, and we'll say my about page. And now on this page, we want to be able to link to a page that describes who we are. So let's give it some quick info. First, the heading 1, what's most important on this page? About me. That way they know exactly what they're getting if all they read was this H1 tag. And then we'll say, that looks good to me. So now I'm going to link to this page, and I will say right here, learn more about me. And now we're going to take about me, or we could take the entire string. Why don't we do that? And we're going to wrap it. Once again, we're using an anchor element, and we're going to specify an attribute name of href or href and an attribute value. And this time, because it's in the exact same directory, in my case, the desktop directory, I can simply reference it like so, about HTML. Come back and I will reload the page. And now notice, because I have never visited this site before, it's not showing that purplish color. It's showing blue. So I'm going to click on it, and now we are on the About Me section. So this is the basic concept between if you were building a static website. Now, a static website is simply a website that is not using a database. It's not determining content dynamically. It's static, meaning every bit is coded in simple markup, and we're not using any kind of server-side language because you're not ready for that just yet. But now we have About Me, but how do we get back to our home page? Well, this is why you would normally have a navigation section that would be present on every page. But for now, let's simply add one more link back to the home page. And we'll call this back to home. And once again, reference it with an anchor tag linking to index.html. Now, one more time, I load the page, and now I can return home. And I can go back and forth. And notice this time, because these pages have been visited, the browser has specific styling that says, if this anchor tag has been visited, meaning if it's in your browser history, then you're going to style it this way so the user has a quick little note to know, I have been here before. Now, coming back to local references. This works because both of these files are stored within the root folder. So why don't we do this? I'm going to create a new folder because you will find with all of your projects, they will be contained within a root folder. So I'm going to say learning. And I'm going to take each of these and drag them in like so. Next, I'm going to create an additional directory. And maybe this will be the About folder because this is going to contain everything related to the About Me page. So I will drag that and bring it in like so. And now let's see what happens with this alone. So first, I need to update my project. So I'm going to close each of these out. And now I'm going to drag this new learning folder back into my editor. And now you can see we can reference the folder. So let's see what has changed now. Let's come back, and now we are referencing desktop learning index.html. So let's see if this link works. If I click it, nope, that didn't work because we are trying to reference, or we are trying to find an about.html file that's within the root, and it's not in the root anymore. It's within an about folder. So we reference about folders by using the name of the folder followed by a /. In this case, we would do about, because that's the name of this folder right here, and then followed by a / like so. Now let's try it. Refresh, click on it, and now we are correctly referencing it. So always make sure that you reference the folder names and you're not always assuming that every file will be within the same directory. But we also must remember the same is true for linking out of directories. This link will not work as well because now we're trying to link to index.html within the about directory, but of course that's not contained within there. So to go up a directory, meaning from the about, go up to the next parent directory and then look for a file called index.html, we do period, /. If you're familiar with the terminal or the command line at all, this will look very familiar to you. So now we're saying go up to the parent directory and then look for, whoops, I am in the wrong file. Let's do it one more time. Go up to the parent directory and then look for index.html. Let's try it again. Refresh. And there we are. So now we are learning how to connect files that are in different folders. Let's take a look at one last thing before we finish up today. Notice how we are referencing an about folder, but then we duplicate that again. So we have about. Now what you'll find is when you name a file index.html, as we've done right here, that becomes the default file to display for a folder. So for example, if we come back to our root learning directory and I don't type in anything, it will still render the index.html file. Click it. And in this case, it's not because we are on our local system, but by default, it should do that. If you have it on a website, this is identical to this. With that in mind, if we have an about folder, we should be able to link automatically to the index.html file. We should be able to change about.html to index. Because these are not within the same folder, you can have multiple files with the same name. So I will do that right now. Rename it to index. Now, if we load the page, this will load instantly once you upload it to your web host. So that is the essentials of what you need to know about using anchor text. It's really not that difficult, is it? In the next lesson, you're going to get to have some fun because we are finally going to learn the very, very basics of working with cascading style sheets or CSS. In a previous episode, we noted how by default, the browser will make anchor tags blue if you have never visited them before. So let's learn how we can override it using the most basic way, the way it was done a long time ago. And that's by using an attribute called style. So just as we can have a href attribute or a target attribute for anchor tags specifically, we can also have style tags that will work on any of the elements that go within the body. So let's try it now. Style equals and then quotation. So notice it follows the exact same format. The name of the attribute is style and the value is what? And this is where we get to use CSS. And CSS takes a specific shape of property name and property value. So in this case, if we want the color to be yellow, why don't we do color followed by a colon, then the value, yellow. Now what we have here is considered a statement. Get the color, make it yellow. Name, colon, value. And then we specify that we are finished by ending it with a semicolon. So let's save that. And now if I come back and reload the page, this text is now yellow, and that's a terrible color. Please don't ever do that. But let's say we want to make it black. Refresh, now it's black. Let's say you come from a print background and you're used to using maybe RGB values. Okay, I can do that as well, RGB, and this means red, green, blue. So let's say 100 red, 200 green, 50 blue. Reload the page, and now we get this nice green color. We also have the option of using what's known as hex values. So that would be a 6-digit sequence that references a specific color. So for example, if I wanted a grayish color, I could do E3, E3, E3. And notice that I prepinned a pound sign to specify that this is a hex value. Now if I load the page, sure enough, we are referencing it like so. So there are many ways that you can specify a color, and it's as simple as using the color name, or if you need more control, do RGB. There's also something called RGBA, which you're not quite ready for yet, and then you can use a hex value. And then there's HSL. There's lots of different ways. I encourage you to research them on your own, but for now, stick with simple declared colors. Notice how this anchor tag has an underline. What if you do not want the underline? Well, that is referenced by a property name called text decoration. Text decoration from the browser is set to, and if we look here, here's all the options that are available. It's set to underline by default. If I reload the page, nothing will happen because that's already the default. If you want to verify this, once again, right-click or control-click, inspect element, and now if we come to the right area right around here, you can see default stylings that are in place. So what we see right here is element.style. It is picking these values up from what we've specified right in here. But we can also review anything that's set by default. So notice user agent style sheet. This is the default style sheet. Text decoration of underline. using this selector, and you'll learn about selector shortly. Just note that because it's crossed out, that means it was overridden by something else. And this is the cascading nature of CSS. You can override previous values so that you can be more specific. In this case, we've overwritten it with our own, so that takes precedence. So now we know we can override the values. So let's change it. And now we're going to say text decoration should be none. I don't want any kind of decoration. Now let's view it, and there's no underline. The first thing you may notice now, though, is very quickly, with two properties alone, our markup is starting to look really messy. And this gets away from the basic idea of using markup to describe our content. We're no longer just solely describing the content, we are styling the content as well. And there should be separation. There should always be separation. And that's why it's better to create a style sheet. We can create a style sheet by creating a new file, and we will give this a name of anything we want. I'll call it style. And to specify that it is a CSS file, it needs to end in an extension of not HTML, but CSS. Now, I will take everything we've declared here. I'm going to cut it, clean this up. And if I paste it in, let's see what happens with that alone. When I come back, reload the page, and now it's no longer taking effect. And why? Well, we've created a new file, but how would the browser possibly know that we want to pull in the styling from this file? And it doesn't. We have to link to it. So would we link to it within the body? You could, but why would you? It's not going to be displayed on the page. It makes much more sense to link to your CSS files, maybe your JavaScripts from the head. So we'll do that. We use a link element to link to a file. Now, we need to tell it what's the relationship to this file. It's a style sheet that we're linking to. Next, where is it? So we're going to use that familiar href property that we learned with anchor tags. The href is going to be style.css. It's in the same directory, so I can reference it simply like so. Now, there will never be text within the link, so we can self-close it the way we did with meta tags. Let's get rid of this and self-close it, or again, it's just okay to do it like so as well. Just be consistent. If I load the page once again, it's still not taking effect. Why is that? Well, let's view the source and figure this out. I'm going to view the source, and you can link to specific pages. So notice, even though I'm in the source, I can view the HTML page that we're not linking to correctly. So now let's see if we are picking up style.css. Click on it, and yes, it is pulling in that file. So for some reason, it's not picking that up. And the reason is, while we can use properties like this specifically within an anchor tag, we can only do so because it's implied what the styling is associated with. When you have style within here, it's implied that we're styling the anchor tag. Within a CSS file, we need to be a little more explicit. In this case, if I want to reference a tag name like anchor tags, I have to use a followed by a curly brace and then followed by a closing curly brace, like so. And now I can take everything here, paste it in, and again, always indent for good practice. So now what we're saying here is find all anchor tags, any element that has a name of A. In this case, it's only referring to this right here. Then execute anything within the surrounding curly braces. And here we're going to get the color, make it red, text decoration, no underline. Let's try it now, and ta-da, now it is taking effect because we have explicitly stated what the styling is associated with. Now, why don't we add a heading tag? Keep it like so, reload the page, and now let's say I want to change the font of the heading 1 tag. Okay, well, we can do that, not by doing the style attribute, even though you can get away from that. It's a very bad practice. I don't want you to do that. Always, when you style something, reference the associated style sheet. And now I'm going to say, find all heading 1 elements and execute anything within the curly braces. In this case, if I want to change the font, I can type font. And if you use a good editor, lots of times they will give you code hints. So if I say font family, you can see here's all of the choices. And you'll learn a little bit more about what fonts to choose in a future lesson. Just know you can't always use any font that's available on your computer, because it likely won't be available on the computer of whoever is browsing your website. So there are HTML safe fonts that will be available on the huge majority of all computers. In this case, I'm going to specify Helvetica and a fallback. And that means if the user does not have Helvetica, fall back to Arial. And then there is a base value called sans serif, and that will refer to, without getting into it too much, a very specific kind of font. However, a good tip to know is sans serif will automatically use one of these fonts if it's available as the default. So what you can do, if you want, is set this to sans serif and make sure you end it with a semicolon, and it will automatically use the most appropriate sans serif font. I'm going to save it, and now if I reload the page, you can see in this case it seems to be using Helvetica. So congratulations, you've gotten your first dose of using CSS. You can do some amazing things with CSS. It's much more powerful than many might think. In the next episode tomorrow, I want to teach you a better way to organize your folder structures, because already things are getting a little bit confusing. So we'll do that in the next episode. Here we have the directory structure for our learning project that we've been working on for the last 4 lessons. But now it's very quickly becoming messy, and we only have a couple files. It is considered a best practice to always divide your images, your CSS files, your JavaScript files, which you will learn about eventually, into their own folders. That way you don't have 30 images within the root. It's much harder to navigate. It's much less organized. So instead, create folders for your CSS and for your images. Now I'm going to take my style and bring it in here. Any images I have will go in the images folder. Once you begin working with JavaScript, you will place any scripts within this folder. And then it's still okay to have dividers for your specific HTML files. It just depends if you need that. It's perfectly okay to have about.html within the root of your project if that's what you want. Now, if we come back to our project, we need to update this. Before, we were referencing style.css, but that will no longer work if I reload the page, as you can see like so. And that's because we are looking for style.css within the root, but we should really be looking within the CSS directory. So now I'm going to say, go into the CSS directory and then find a style sheet called style.css. Reload the page, and now all is working fine, and we've organized our files much more cleanly. So always do this for each new project. You may even find that it's smart for you to create a base folder and file structure for all new projects. That way you don't have to create these folders and files manually every single time, and I highly recommend you do that. In the next lesson, I'm going to teach you about images. Here I have an image called builder.jpg, and we want to be able to display that on our HTML page. So let's learn how we do that. The first step is, of course, to open up our directory structure, and we want to place all images, as we learned in yesterday's episode. They should all be placed within the images folder. So I will do that now. Now I can close this out, return to my project, and you can see that it is in fact being referenced. So now let's reference that image, and I'm going to hit enter a couple times and we'll paste it right here. We use an image by using the img for image element. Because there will never be text within an image, that doesn't make sense. Just as we did with links and meta elements, we can self-close it. Let's see what this alone does though in the browser. I'm going to come back, refresh, and we don't see anything at all. And that's because, quite naturally, there is no reference here, so we have an empty image element. It should be noted though, this may not be the case in all browsers. You'll find that in versions of Internet Explorer, it'll display a nasty X, meaning could not find the image. So make sure that you aren't referencing empty images or images that do not exist. In this case, let's come back. We can reference an image not by doing href, which you might expect, by doing something called src. That's source. What is the source of this image? That's going to be equal to a value, and the source is going to be img/builder. Now let's come back, and if I load the page, now we are referencing that image as we would hope. We need to do one more thing for this image though. It is a best practice, and you should always do this. Provide alternate text for this image, just in case the image is not available or images are turned off by whoever is browsing your website. They need to be able to have some feedback as to what this image represents. And I will simply say construction hat. And now if I load the page again, you're not going to see anything. But if I were to turn off images, you would see a little tooltip that said construction hat. And that's really good for screen readers and things of that nature. Now we can also link to images that are stored on the web. This is common if you use something like Amazon storage. But there's another way you can do it. And it's important that we go over this. Here's an image on NetTuts. I'm going to right click it or control click and choose copy image URL. Now, if I come back, I can link to an absolute URL by pasting that in. And if I come back, we can change the alternate text to Envato. And if I load the page, as you would expect, we are loading that image. So you might think that's really helpful. This is really a big no-no. And the reason is we can build a whole website by referencing images that are stored on NetTuts or any website. But the problem is whoever owns NetTuts, us in that case, have to pay the bandwidth for displaying images on your website, and that is not fair. This is what's referred to as hot linking, and it's a bad practice, so please don't do it. If there is an image on the web that you want to use and you have permission to use it, right-click, save image as. In this case, we're going to save it to learning images, and we'll call it Envato. And now we can reference it locally, like so, and we're not hot linking envato.png. Come back, reload the page, and I am referencing it incorrectly, and that's because I forgot to include the folder name. Go into the images folder, then find it, and now we are getting it, but we are not hot linking and making somebody else pay for our bandwidth. The only thing I want to caution you is, again, if you're going to do this, you must make sure that you have permission to use images and it's not copyrighted. So whether that means emailing whoever owns the website and requesting it, or only using images that specifically allow you to redistribute them and use them any way you see fit. So again, to include an image, we use the image element, we specify a source that references where the image is stored, and then we specify alternate text for when images is turned off. In the next lesson, I'm going to teach you about divs. If I open my CSS folder and we go to style.css, there is something called margins that allow us to add some spacing. So let's imagine within our H1 element, I want to provide some margin left. Now I could add it right here and that would be fine. And you know what? Some developers do prefer that. In my case, I've found that it's not best for me. I prefer to have each property on its own line. It's easier for my eyes to absorb, but you can decide for yourself. Anyhow, so let's say I want to provide some margin left. And let's say we want to do 50, and there is a unit of measurement that's very common for websites, and that's called pixels. You will quickly become acquainted with them, but there are some other options as well, such as percentages and ems. For now, we will stick with pixels. Notice again, my property name is margin left, then a colon, then the value is 50 px, and then we end it with a semicolon. Let's come back and load the page. And now can you see that we've added some spacing? We've added a bit of margin on the left side of the heading 1 tag. But now, if we want some room all around, notice this right here is up against the edge. It sounds like we need to add some to that as well. Let's come back to HTML. And it seems that with the paragraph tag, we should add the same thing. So now I'm going to reference all paragraph elements, and then I'm going to type the exact same thing. Now if we load the page, this one is working, but again, the image element isn't working either. And this is starting to get really sloppy once again. How can we clean this up? Well, there's a couple options. One, we can simply group these together. So notice how the H1 is referencing it and the P is referencing it. We can specify multiple elements by using a comma within our selector. So I'm going to remove this, and now I will say get all heading 1 elements and, using a comma, get all P elements and apply margin left. If I load the page, we're getting the exact same effect, but we've cleaned it up a good bit. Still though, if we want to do the same thing for the image, we'd have to do comma image, reload the page, and now that's working. But we have another problem. We would have to do this for every single element on the page, and when we are referencing it like so, what if you have an image later in your document that you don't want to receive all of this margin? This is a bad practice. Instead, it's customary to wrap related material within something called a div, or there are other choices as well. In this case, we will use a div. Wrap everything we want to include within a div, and then I will indent it. So I want you to think of divs as a way to position your content. They do not describe your content. They do not style your content. They simply allow you to position it much more efficiently. I'll explain this a little bit more shortly, but now let's come back and say div. Reload the page, and notice we're getting the exact same effect, and that's because rather than being manual and saying get the H1, then get the paragraph, then get the element, we're saying get this entire bucket, get this entire container, and provide some spacing around it. And that's how I want you to think of divs, as buckets. When you wrap elements, any number of elements within a div or a bucket, you're saying, I'm going to put all of this stuff within this bucket. That way I can easily move it around when I need to, and I don't have to pick up each element or each toy or each item one at a time. I just pick up the bucket and move it around or position it however I need to. This is the only purpose of a div, to assist you with positioning or styling your content. Again, it has no semantic value. It has no specific stylistic value. It's just a bucket, but you'll find you'll use it quite a bit. For example, if we go back to NetTuts, you'll notice that the entire, if I zoom out, our entire website seems to be positioned in the very middle. And that is because this entire main section is wrapped within a div. And then we can say get that parent div and make sure that the spacing on the left and the spacing on the right is the exact same value. Let's see how we could do that on our project. We have a wrapping div, and now again, I'm going to be very generalized. Remember, when I say this, I'm not saying get just this first div. You are saying select every single div on the page. You'll get to the point where you need to be more specific, but for now, we don't need to. Now, if I set margin to auto, we're telling the browser to automatically determine what the margins should be. Next, I'm going to specify a width for our div. So I'm going to say a width of 500 pixels. Now, let's see what that does. If I load the page, notice it moved it to the middle. So this might be a little more understandable if we first add a background color of red. Now, you can see that we've created a bucket or a container that's 500 pixels high. The height, because it has not been explicitly stated here, will be determined by the height of all of the content within the bucket. Now, when we add margin, auto, we are saying, I want you to make the margin left and the margin right of this div identical, the exact same width. And the only way that's possible is if this is perfectly centered on the page. That way, the spacing on the left will be 400 pixels or so, and the spacing on the right will have to be the exact same value. I'll refresh, and now we're getting the same effect, and this is something you'll do quite often when building maybe your first website, is you will create a wrapping container, and then you will center it on the page. So already, we're getting the glimpse of how you would build an actual website. Good job. Once again, though, within this div, we had a new section, and we'll give this a heading to My New Section. Remember, you would only wrap this new section within a div if you had a reason to. Just don't do it by default, always adding divs. This is what's known as divitis. Too many divs when you don't need to. We're going to accept that we need it for this case. Well, now watch what happens. Refresh, and now we are styling every div. You can see this more clearly if I were to say text align, get the text and align it to the center. Refresh, notice it's being applied to this as well. So if you want to only reference a parent div, we need a way to identify it, and you'll learn that in the next episode. In today's lesson, we're going to be taking a look at IDs and classes. And these are simply ways that we can assign labels to specific elements so that we can then target them within our style sheets. Let's look at an example. As you can see here, I have a blank page with an unordered list with just a bit of gibberish here. Our goal is we want to make this list item have a color of red. So if you want, you can pause and see if you can figure out how you would do it. Now, in a previous lesson, I showed you how to link to an external style sheet, and this is very important. It's a best practice. Do this in your projects. However, there's also another way that we can do it, and this is referred to as inline CSS. And this can be helpful if you have a very small project, or let's say you're working on a very tiny demo and you want to send it off. Sometimes it doesn't make sense to have extra files when it's so small. In this case, within the head, we're going to learn a new element, and this is called style. Now, we can add CSS properties within here the same way we would as if it was a style sheet. Just note, within the head of your document, wrap everything within a style tag. Now, to give you an example, if we set the body, and we set the background color of the body element, meaning the wrapping body element, is going to have a background of red. Let's try that out. And as you would expect, the CSS is being applied correctly. Good. So now let's get back to our assignment. We need to make this third list item right here red. How would you do that? Well, let's try a couple examples first. We can search for all list items, and we're going to make the color red. If I refresh, as we would expect, every single list item is being applied, but in our case, we need a way to target this one exclusively. Now, I'm going to show you 3 different ways that we can do this, easy to hardest. So the first option is to use an identifier. So I will come down to the element that I wish to target, and I'm going to add an attribute called ID. ID for identification or identifier. And now I'm going to give it a name of something that describes what this element is. Remember, with semantics, we don't want to be specific, and we don't want to say third li. That is a terrible ID, because watch what happens as soon as we move it maybe down here. Now this ID makes no sense because it's the 4th one, right? So always describe it rather than be specific. In this case, maybe here we would like to apply emphasis here. So this describes it. It's an emphasized section. Well, now I can reference any ID within my CSS by doing # and then the name of the ID. So in this case, I will copy this and paste it in. And then within curly braces, I add my styling per usual. Now we're saying, look on the page for an element that has an ID of emphasis. Let's try it out now. And as you would expect, only the 3rd element is red because that's all we targeted. Let's see what would happen if we add another ID here of emphasis as well. If I refresh, it is going to work, but I don't want you to do this. This is a bad practice. We use IDs to target specific elements. They are not intended to group elements together. And while a browser will allow you to get away with it, it's a very bad practice in the web design community, and you shouldn't do it. Instead, we use what's known as classes. They are quite similar to IDs, but the main difference being we use an ID to target one element. We use classes to style a group of elements. So for example, what about all buttons that's on your website? There will be numerous ones. If you want them all to receive your button styling, it would make sense to apply a class of button to any applicable elements. That way, we use a class to style groups of elements. Here, I'm going to select ID, and I'm going to change it to class. Now, to target a class, we don't use the #, that's for IDs. Instead, we use a period to reference a class. And this time we'll make the color green. If I refresh, now you can see we're doing it the proper way. When you want the group styling, you use a class, and you create that by using a period at the beginning. And that translates in human speak to find the elements that have a class attribute that is equal to emphasis and style them like so. If we come back, I told you I would show you 3 ways, but we've only gone over 2. An important distinction to make is that you don't want to litter your HTML with IDs everywhere. So you don't want to apply an ID here and then an ID to every single list item and every element. Even though it might seem like that would help because then you can target anything you want to, it's a bad practice, especially when there are multiple ways to target elements without using identifiers. Some of these are part of CSS3, which is the next standard for cascading style sheets. And the downside is that some of these aren't available in all browsers. And this is something you're going to find. Just because it works in the latest version of Chrome doesn't mean it'll work in maybe Internet Explorer 7. And this is something that's going to make you tear your hair off once you get a little bit further into web design. But let's try it. This time, no ID, we're still going to target my. And this is the way that I would personally do it. I'm going to type li colon nth child. Now within parentheses here, we can specify which list item we need to target. In this case, we want to target the third one, so I will type 3. And this time I will make the color orange. Refresh the page, and now without using a specific identifier, we were still able to target the third list item. Let's see what happens when we duplicate this unordered list a few times. One more time, and now I want you to note it's targeting the third list item for each occurrence. So note that we're not saying find the very third list item and that's it. We're looking for a list item, and then we're finding the nth child of its parent. So look for a list item, get its parent, and then look for the third child. 1, 2, 3. I got that one. The next one, exact same thing. So don't think that you're targeting only one. You could be targeting a group. Now you might be thinking, how would we target just this one if we wanted to use this format and we don't want to style any of these other unordered lists? Well, again, you have a couple options. One, you could apply the identifier, and we'll just give it an ID of sect for the time being. And we could do it like so, refresh, and now we're targeting it. Or you could use some more advanced CSS selectors, but that's the fun thing about CSS is there's multiple ways to solve any problem. In this case, there's another way we could do UL first of type. And if I refresh, you can see we are successfully targeting that first one, again, without using a selector. Now, if this is getting confusing, don't worry. There are probably plenty of designers who have never used first of type. But if we were to go through this, we're saying get all unordered lists, then filter them down. We only want the first of type, meaning the first of the type unordered list. So we find the very first one. Then we add a space, and this is where we can further select down. And now we're saying within this unordered list, look for an LI, but the third child. So 1, 2, 3, and we target, and then we style it orange. Okay, so in this lesson, you've learned a little bit about pseudo-classes, and more importantly, you've learned how to use IDs and classes to target elements on the page.